Hello. How can you hear us? Okay, great. Ellie and Britta, if you can just say a few words to check the sound before we start.
Yep, how about that? Can you hear me okay?
That's perfect. Britta?
Brilliant.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
I think so, yes. Great. Thank you so much. We'll be starting very soon. Thanks for your patience. Slides for the speaker that I All right, I think we can start. Good evening, everybody. So welcome to our event entitled From Battlefields to Biosphere. We are very happy to greet both the offline participants, but also people joining us online. I hope you can also hear and see as well, but if not, please flag that in the chat. My name is Cristina Parenti. I'm the Senior Policy Officer at the Dutch peace organization called PAX, but I represent specifically the Environment, Peace and Security team. And in our organization, although we are part of the bigger peace movement, we have been focusing specifically on the work in conflict-affected countries. We have been operating in over 15 countries for now, and we are working with local partners on peace building and conflict resolution. Moreover, since 2009, PAX has been working to collect environmental data to see how environmental damage affects civilians and the environments. And PAX has spearheaded the methodology to map environmental risks and to help authorities, local communities to be better aware about those risks affecting their lives and livelihoods. So today, it's only fitting that at UNIA 6, where the theme of UNIA 6 is effective and inclusive multilateral action to address global environmental challenges or the triple planetary crisis, we also speak about this dimension, how environmental dimensions of war and conflict and the broader linkages to insecurity affect the global efforts, but also what can be done about this. So what we have been seeing in terms of UNIA negotiations and discussions is that very often, are we good with the online connection? Are we good? Okay.
Yeah.
No, we don't need slides now.
Okay, yeah.
Very often we have the separation of the discussion into silos. So when we speak about insecurity, peace and conflict, this is the one strain of discussion. When we speak about environment and climate, those are the detached discussions. But our objective with this event was actually to merge everything together and to unpack how conflicts and insecurity affect the triple planetary crisis, what are the contributions to these global challenges, and what we can do in respective, with respect to each of this field. So to do that, we have a great panel, both online and offline. And I'm very happy to introduce to you Alice Ruveza, to my left side, Senior Director for Policy Influence and Engagement at World Wildlife Fund International. Then we have Dr. Marcos Orellana, Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, to my right. And joining us online, we have Britta Sjosted, the Senior Lecturer at the Department of Law at Lund University. And we have also Ellie Kinney, the campaigner and the leader of project on military emissions at CEOPS. You may have also noticed that we had another speaker listed on the agenda, but unfortunately this discussion coincides with the negotiations on the very same topic on conflicts. So I hope we can make great use of this time. And why don't we start straight away with a fundamental question to all of our speakers. So what is the interconnection between environmental dimensions of conflicts, military activities, and the triple planetary crisis that we are facing? I would like to start with Special Rapporteur, who has been working a lot on toxics and pollution, including the questions of pollution from conflict. And I would like to ask you to elaborate, how do you see that connection and how do you work on that? How do you address that in your work?
Thank you very much, Christina. Thank you to the organizers of this event to address such a timely topic on toxics and arms conflict will be the focus of my few minutes remarks. I will build on the work that one of my predecessors in the Toxics and Human Rights Mandate, he prepared a thematic report in 2007 on conflict and hazardous substances. There's also been reports on country visits to Kazakhstan, to the Republic of the Marshall Islands. I'm preparing a report now on my visit to Australia, all of which touch upon elements of this. So diving right into it, pollution and conflict. There are several points of interface. One is in the conduct of hostilities. If we look back in time, we see that contamination in the trenches in France, for example, dating from World War I, are still visible today. They pose impacts on the ability to grow food that's free of hazardous pollutants. A couple of other examples, more recent, the use of Agent Orange as a defoliant in Vietnam, or the use of depleted uranium in Iraq and Serbia, or the destruction of industrial facilities in Pančevo in Serbia, the releases of dichloroethane, or what's happening today or recently in the Sudan in the destruction of oil refineries, the use of white phosphorus in Gaza. All of this goes to the conduct of hostilities and the use of certain weapons. One point that I wish to highlight is that this interface between toxics and conflict does not only arise in international armed conflicts, it can also very well happen in internal armed conflicts. I have written allegation letters. These are tools that the mandate has to bring to the attention of governments human rights violations in respect of the threat of use of glyphosate spraying in Colombia for the forced eradication of the coca leaf in the failed war against drugs. The internal armed conflict dimension of that is the context of those policies. In addition to hostilities, whether international or internal armed conflict, there's also in the life cycle of what we could say war, the design of weapons and the testing of weapons. My mandate has been seized with several allegations and several pieces of evidence regarding nuclear legacies. As the International Day of Remembrance of Nuclear Legacies is coming up, March 5th, we honor the victims of exposure of nuclear radiation. British tests conducted in Australia in the lands of indigenous peoples, Maralinga, for example, or French tests conducted in Algeria. American tests conducted in the Republic of the Marshall Islands, tests conducted in Kazakhstan. There are various instances of nuclear legacies that the world is still grappling to address, because while the detonations may have been years ago, decades ago, in many instances, the impacts and effects reverberate to this day, both in the health of the environment as well as in the memory of the peoples concerned and the victims that have suffered from radioactive exposure. But there's more. In the relation to conflict, we often see that there may be refugees that flee from areas in conflict. And in regard to Roma populations in the conflict concerning Kosovo, they were housed by the United Nations in places that were contaminated by lead. So they were exposed to lead as a result of the UN's intervention. So this is UN responsibility for exposure. So there's an angle there in terms of what kind of safeguards and protections do refugees get from the United Nations and from other actors. I have written, and my predecessor has also written, letters to the Secretary General in regards to the UN's human rights responsibility. The UN has failed so far to uphold the recommendations of its own human rights panel. So this is certainly a matter of concern. This is an opportunity for me to also underscore that as UN Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights mandate, this is an independent mandate. It's a special procedure of the Human Rights Council. So if the United Nations is responsible for human rights violations, I can also act on that. One last point that I thought I'd mention in terms of the interface between pollution and conflict, the impacts of global crisis of pollution associated to conflict is debris. The debris resulting from destruction that often accompanies conflict. We've seen this certainly in other contexts as well, natural disasters. We've seen this told by the earthquake in Turkey, and then the questions of contaminated material because of the use of certain hazardous substances in construction. When it comes to the explosions of buildings, many of them use asbestos. Asbestos, as we know, is a highly hazardous substance. When it's undisturbed, there's not so much to worry about. Of course, it continues to be hazardous, but it's when the fibers become loose that the exposure happens largely through inhalation, and this can lead to cancers or mesothelioma. When it comes to fires, depending on what is combustion, there can be toxic ash. The toxic ash, if it's not addressed properly, there can also be situations of exposure and pollution that connect to conflict. And the last point is unexplored ordinances. This is a situation in Laos and in other places where there's so many unexplored ordinances that are littering the fields, are posing physical threats to the population, but also the threats of the contaminants, the pollutants, the hazardous substances that these ordinances contain. So that gives a bit of an overview of the interface between pollution and toxics, where we can begin to understand and consider the magnitude of this interface.
Thank you very much. I think that really provided a very good picture of how all these components are intertwined, the conflict, pollution, but also human health and other very long-ranging consequences. Then, of course, pollution is one of the triple planetary crises as defined by UNEA's team. We have another one, biodiversity loss. And here I would like to turn to Alice because your organization, WW Fund, is known worldwide as the conservation organization. And I think everybody will be really curious to hear about your experience, specifically here in Africa. How do you see this interplay in your field? How do you see environment, peace, security, and broader issues coming together in your own work?
Thank you very much for this and for inviting me to share perspectives on this. I will expand, of course, my talk to go beyond armed conflict. Armed conflict is probably one of them, but as you know, environmental degradation and biodiversity loss are part of a complex web of interactions with different social, economic, political, and environmental drivers. And simultaneously, of course, conflict and insecurity contribute to environmental destruction and degradation. And together, they form this interaction that we call the nature security nexus. And not only can nature and environmental factors drive insecurity, but conflict and insecurity are also drivers of environmental degradation. So we see a lot of interlinkages between nature, security, and conflict back and forth. We see that conflict over natural resources, for example, can undermine national security and weaken legitimacy of the state. For example, if a freshwater ecosystem collapses due to extensive exploitation or pollution, the people who depend on it have to compete over reduced supply of fresh water, resulting into conflict related by security and migration. Some are related to some of the points made earlier. We see this in many places, and addressing these issues becomes vital also for them, not just for us who work in nature, but also for the Ministry of Defense, for the military, because they can result in political insecurity. So by reducing this conflict within the state, in many ways, the military is able to indirectly increase security of the state itself. The degradation of the environment undermines the security of states and other actors, and moreover, environmental degradation often interacts with socio-economic, political, and cultural drivers, which when taken together exacerbate conflict, as mentioned. And then maybe just also say that security is not just a matter of the state for national governments, it's also a subnational issue. Any threat that degrades the quality of the life of citizens becomes a national security threat. And failure to protect our local communities' rights to forests can threaten livelihoods and reduce human security. And so those were just big points, but I'm going to go down to Africa in particular. And maybe the last point before I move to Africa is the fact that military operations, of course, represent a large source of environmental degradation, which he equally has just made. And when I say environmental degradation, I'm including biodiversity loss in there as well. In the African context, currently about 30% or more countries in Africa are affected by conflict, and it is estimated to result into 2.5 lower annual growth relative to a no conflict scenario. Cumulatively, the continent loses an estimated 15% of its GDP every year due to this conflict. When you look at illegal mining and logging, we lose about 88.6 billion, 3.5% of our gross domestic product annually in illicit financial flows. That's according to UNCTAD. And that's probably 2 years, the figures could have changed now. And it's clear that tackling these issues would enable Africa to provide citizens with basic social services such as adequate water, sanitation, and others, and almost halve the 200 billion annual financing gap that we face if we could deal with that. Environmental crimes, of course, as mining and dumping, as has been talked about, affect our quality of air and survival of species. Conflict for us is linked to socioeconomic opportunities. You will find that in many places when people lack opportunities, their stake in a peaceful society is diminished. We see this in the Sahel and other places. We've heard a lot about 85% of recruits to terrorist organizations have gone there because of the lack of these opportunities, low access to employment. Conflict, of course, depletes precious natural resources, but also importantly, it is a security threat for indigenous people and local communities who live near these resources and have lived near them for years and depend on them for their livelihood. It's also conflict also erodes the culture of these communities, which is extremely important. So governments in Africa are increasingly under very increasing pressure to manage our natural resources and to resolve these conflicts. But then, in most places where this takes place, there is weak governance. There are places where there is weak governance, and I think it's important to face the fact that where there is weak governance, you will find that when conflict happens there, it happens continuously. There's a vicious cycle because of that, and the need to address that. And of course, with the youngest population we have in Africa, we bear a high risk unless we resolve these issues. Armed conflict has been talked about, but I definitely should talk about the displacement that comes from that. I think the refugees, you talked about those, which are big issues as well. And yeah, I think I will stop there for now. But the main point to say, and I really wanted to make, is that beyond armed conflict, there are the social economic issues around this that also exacerbate. And I think the existence of those means that whatever happens results into conflict beyond those, and that governance is a big issue.
Thank you very much. And I just wanted to reiterate what you just mentioned about the vicious circle that, of course, these challenges, they bring together one on the top of another. And another huge challenge that, of course, was very topical during the COP discussions recently is the climate change. We have it as another planetary crisis featured in this year's UNIA discussion. So now I'd like to turn online to Ellie, who has been working a lot to recognize the contribution of military activities to the climate change, and just to ask to tell us more about how do you see the interlinkage there, and since this is a relatively new topic, what have been your findings so far about this interconnection?
Thank you so much, Christina. Do we have slides, by the way? Because I can't see them, but I don't know whether other people can.
Yet, slides COPS, we should have them online.
People online can't see. I don't know if there's been slides for the other speakers as well. People online can't see.
We don't have them yet, but maybe, yes, if you could just.
I'll get going. And yeah, we'll see how we go. Maybe the slides will appear. But yeah, I'll kick off anyway. But firstly, thank you so much for having me and for organising this really important event. As has been mentioned, I'm here from the Conflict and Environment Observatory, or COBS for short, which is a UK charity which works to increase the protection of people and ecosystems from the impacts of armed conflicts and military activities. So this conversation today is really very much interlinked with our work. And part of that work is a joint project called the Military Emissions Gap, where we seek to highlight the military contribution to the climate crisis and advocate for more transparent reporting of military greenhouse gas emissions. So currently, no country is obliged to report their military emissions data to the UNFCCC. It's entirely voluntary, and what this results in is a poor quality data set at best, and at worst, no data at all. So in the absence of better data, we worked with Scientists for Global Responsibility to estimate the military's global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this isn't based on UNFCCC data because there's simply not enough to go off. But it takes into consideration things like military sizes, stationary emissions data that we do know, and factoring in a multiplier to take into account the likely scale of the supply chain. And we've seen some slides, which is excellent. If we could go back a couple of slides, I think it'll probably be the second or third slide. There we go. One over, please. Perfect. Excellent. Thank you so much. There we go. So this estimate that we sort of calculated, it doesn't go off UNFCCC data because there simply isn't enough to go off. But the best estimate that we have, which takes into consideration things like military size, the kind of stationary emissions data that we do know, and factoring in a multiplier to take into consideration the likely scale of the supply chain. And the best estimate that we have suggests that militaries globally are responsible for around 5.5% of all greenhouse gas emissions, which means that if the world's militaries combined were a country, it would have the fourth highest carbon footprint, only beaten by China, the US, and India. And if we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you so much. So here you can see where we are now in terms of reporting. So for the militaries that do choose to report some of their emissions to the UNFCCC, this tends to cover scope 1, which is mostly sort of fuel use, and scope 2, which is energy purchased. But as we move into scope 3, we have very little data. Now, scope 3 covers the military supply chain. And in comparable industries, supply chain emissions can be between 3 to sort of 7 times greater than scopes 1 and 2. So just gives you an idea of the kind of scale of underreporting that goes on here. And we developed a framework which also suggests an additional category, scope 3 plus, which includes the emissions from warfighting and things like infrastructure damage, rebuilding urban areas, medical care, and the displacement of people. And currently no militaries are tracking scope 3, and the carbon impact of wars are not considered within global accounting whatsoever. If you could move to the next slide, please. So when we talk about militaries causing an estimated 5.5% of global emissions, this doesn't take wars into account. It's sort of everyday military activity that happens during peacetime, which is where the majority of emissions happen. So for example, right now, I think until the end of June, NATO are leading their biggest military exercise since the Cold War. But this won't be accounted for in NATO's emissions reporting. We do know that these large-scale training exercises have a huge carbon footprint. Last year's Air Defender exercise emitted at least the equivalent of the annual emissions from around 19,540 cars. And this is a minimum estimation that doesn't take into account things like other vehicles or equipment used. And additionally, we only know this piece of information because a German parliamentarian asked a question ahead of the exercise. This data has to be asked for. It's not publicly available. And in fact, NATO explicitly excludes training and exercises from its recently published reporting methodology. Go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the UNFCCC's reporting exemption has meant that militaries have been excluded from the conversation around reducing emissions. But this is starting to change as they are sort of under an increasing amount of pressure to act. But it's vital that civil society organisations are at the forefront of this. I've already mentioned that NATO emissions reporting methodology excludes training and exercises, which is a dramatic exclusion. And it's exclusions like this which highlight that we shouldn't let militaries set their own standards here. So we've set out this framework for military emissions reporting, which you can find on our website, and this is a snapshot of it here, which helps stakeholders understand the sources of emissions within militaries. And holding militaries to high standards like this framework is really key to ensuring that reporting is truly robust and transparent, and not just simply a sort of military grade greenwashing exercise. If you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So as we've already mentioned, emissions from warfighting are missing from global carbon accounting. There is no internationally agreed methodology for counting conflict emissions. And when Russia invaded Ukraine, a team of researchers set about estimating the carbon impact of the invasion, which is kind of the first time that estimations like this had been carried out during a conflict. And you can see here the sources that they've taken into account. The war fighting itself takes up 25% of the total, alongside factors like fires, the movement of refugees, targeting of infrastructure like Nord Stream, and disruptions to civil aviation. But the highest percentage is taken up by reconstruction, which also highlights the carbon cost of destroying urban areas alongside, obviously, the really tragic human cost of this. And taking all of these sources into account, the Initiative on Greenhouse Gas Accounting of War estimates that the first 18 months of the war has resulted in 150 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent, which is comparable to the annual emissions of a country the size of Belgium. And that's one more. We can move to the next slide, please. And as this area of research continues to develop, it's allowed researchers to use this developing methodology to estimate the emissions from other conflicts going on at the moment. The first estimate of the impacts of the war in Gaza was published in January, and covered the first 60 days. And they estimated that the first 2 months of this conflict have been comparable to the emissions caused by 75 coal-fired power plants operating for a whole year, which is it's more emissions than 20 climate vulnerable nations produce in a year. And again, we can see here, this highlights a huge impact of destroying towns and cities and urban areas. When we consider the bigger picture alongside warfighting itself, we see that rebuilding Gaza and an estimated 100,000 properties would emit the equivalent of the annual emissions of New Zealand. I'll give you a second to kind of sit with all of that information and all of those figures and think about what this means for sorts of additional humanitarian impacts of a carbon footprint of this scale that remains unaccounted for. I'll move to the next slide, please. So the issue with missing data is that it in turn creates a lack of attention from academia and civil society, which has led to military and conflict emissions being largely ignored by the mainstream climate movement until recently. For example, last year marked the first time that UNEP's flagship emissions gap report made a substantive mention of the impact of military emissions. And even still, this is just one sentence. And at this stage of the climate crisis, no sector can be exempt from their role in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, especially not a sector as polluting as the military. But we need the climate movement to engage on this topic with us and help shine a light on these missing emissions, to change the UNFCCC reporting guidelines and enable a route to accountability for military and conflict emissions. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Just to sum up and leave you with some final thoughts. Despite the missing data, estimations from ourselves and from colleagues show that militaries and armed conflicts are significant causes of emissions. And to address this, we need change on a UNFCCC level and to mainstream this topic. The recent work that's been done around estimating conflict emissions has certainly helped to mainstream this topic in the climate movement and in the press. And this vital work to highlight another horrific cost of conflict alongside, the humanitarian, economic, and wider environmental impacts. And what we need urgently is a more intersectional approach to our advocacy. And collaboration is essential between the climate movement and the peace movement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And as we have just heard from all speakers, there are multiple ways how conflicts, insecurity, military activities exacerbate global challenges. And of course, those challenges stand beyond environmental challenges. But if we zoom in on environmental aspects of conflicts more directly, of course, we have also the issue of the protection of the environment. And Britta, now I would like to turn to you because you have extensively researched the topic why environment enjoys, or perhaps not enjoys, but has less of the protection compared to other areas. And you have focused extensively on the value of nature. So I would like to ask you, how could you elaborate on different attitudes that we have now in the international norms about the protection of environment? And how does this relate at all with the triple planetary crisis discussion?
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm sorry not being able to be with you in Nairobi, but thank you so much for this opportunity, and thank you for the question. I would like to start with focusing on the law of armed conflict and why it's not a legal framework that is primarily concerned with the environment or environmental protection. It's really the law that applies in the extreme events of armed conflict, and it provides only the minimum protection. It's aimed to scale down the legal protection and focus on like the most basic fundamental protection, like protecting civilians or the combat, medical units, limit warfare not to cause unnecessary suffering or superfluous injury. So this is really the roots of laws of armed conflict, to protect the people that are affected by war. And the environment is really seen as a secondary concern. it's more the stage for where the battlefield is taking place and not something that is in need of protection on its own. But this is something we can see has changed over the years, and that has, of course, to do with how we value the environment and what has happened to the environment. And I think it's interesting to see how specific conflict has also helped to zoom in to the need to protect the environment better in armed conflicts. And I think one of the first examples that really had an impact on the legal framework is the example of Vietnam. Special Rapporteur already mentioned the spraying of Agent Orange, the chemicals that persisted for many years in the Vietnam War, destroying millions of hectares of forest. And not only that, it also had severe impacts of public health many decades to come after this. And this led to that you saw how the environment not only is affected, but also how the environment itself can be used in warfare to add military advantages for the warring parties. So this led to that in 1977, the additional protocol 1 was adopted, and this was the first time provision in a treaty of law of armed conflict actually included direct protection of the environment. This protection, however, is quite weak. It sets a ceiling where it's above the ceiling or the threshold, and the threshold is widespread, long-term and severe damage to the environment. That is prohibited in warfare. But this leaves most of the conventional warfare aside from being prohibited. There was also another convention adopted a few years later after the additional protocol 1, the NMOD convention, that focused on certain environmental techniques of manipulating the forces of the environment in warfare. But all of these, like both the additional protocol 1, the provisions protecting the environment, and the NMOD convention, they, as I mentioned, they don't affect conventional warfare. Most of the environmental damage that is the result of conventional warfare would not be prohibited by this provision. And I think this has a lot to do with the fact that international law, which is really like it's really focused on states and state sovereignty and the ability of states to defend themselves. And states are very reluctant to have any provision that interfere too much with their ability to conduct war. So it's extremely hard within the framework of law of armed conflict to actually develop new laws or new treaties that would interfere in the warfare in general, I would say, and in particular with the environment, because the environment can be defined very broadly. It's everywhere. It's, as I mentioned before, the stage where the battlefields takes place. There is, however, some indirect protection of the environment, and most states would today agree that the environment, as long as it's not used for any military purposes, it would be considered civilian. And as a civilian object, it would have protection of under the general rules of protection of laws of armed conflict, such as the principles of distinction, proportionality, precautions in attack. But the problem with this general or indirect protection of the environment is that still a lot of environmental damage can occur lawfully. So as a result of attacking a military target, and if you look at the collateral damage that will be done to the environment, but also to civilian lives and other civilian objects. But as a civilian object, you will only measure the collateral damage in relation to the weight or the importance of the military advantage anticipated of that attack. And this is according to the proportionality principle, where you do this assessment. And it's only if the collateral damage weighs, it's much more, or like it loses in this assessment, then it could be unlawful. But in many of these instances, attacks at, for instance, oil refineries, industrial complex infrastructure, chemical industries, and so on, that will actually be considered lawful under many circumstances in an armed conflict. And this is despite the fact that this will lead to quite extensive environmental damage, leaks into rivers, poisoning drinking water, leaving toxic remnants. So this is one of the big problems, that the environment is seen as a civilian object among others. And this is mainly because of this instrumental view of the environment as a commodity or a property. And it misses that the environment is actually something else. The environment is a network of ecosystems, and we actually don't really know how these damages will affect the ecosystem and how the ecosystem will affect each other. And I think this is particularly interesting and relevant in light of the triple planetary crisis, where most of the armed conflicts are taking place, where countries are affected most by this triple crisis. And this means that we heard a bit before about the vicious circle of violence, that the humans will be affected, public health will be affected, livelihood will be affected, and this will not only damage the environment and the livelihoods, but it would also really make it very hard for any prospects of peace. And much of this can actually be done lawfully under the current laws of armed conflict. I just wanted to also highlight that we do see a lot of development since the 1970s and 80s, when these two instruments were adopted. And in particular, I would like to raise two initiatives that have contributed to reshape the legal landscape, or at least reshape the legal debate in this area. And that is the adoption of the ICRC environmental guidelines and the principle by the ILC that are protecting the environment in relation to armed conflicts. I think both of these initiatives or instruments are trying to incorporate a more modern view of the environment that we can see in international environmental law, for instance. But the problem is that this is not anything that is binding in itself. It's not incorporated into a treaty, and it's only binding as far as it's viewed as international customary law, and very much of these guidelines are and principles are not part of international customary law. And as I mentioned before, there is a lot of reluctance from states to actually acknowledge them and recognize these as customary law. So I think, to conclude, that the instrumental and anthropocentric view of the environment is still very much predominant in the laws of armed conflict, and this makes it extremely hard to make states and individuals accountable for environmental damage that occurs in the context of armed conflict today. So I think I stop there.
Thank you very much. I think since we are basically have covered already the problem definition part of this discussion, that I think it's quite evident that the interconnections are numerous and they are complex. We have also heard from several speakers that there have been some developments to address them, but of course we are still very far from overcoming those challenges. And we have heard messages that we need to address those challenges comprehensively. We need to have advocacy which is not focused on one specific area, but it should be really all-encompassing. And before we move to the next part, when I will be asking all our speakers about the solutions in their respective field, I also wanted to share the experience of our organization, PAX, if we can put up the slides, how we kind of bridge these problems which we observe and the advocacy around it. And maybe that can serve as a bridge also to elaborate on what can be additional views, what can be improved in each particular field. So slides are coming up, but as I have mentioned before, for us, the first point is actually to identify what is the key issue. And for that, of course, data and information and the scope of damage is crucial. So as the first step, we are using open source investigations, we are using remote sensing, and we try to map the challenges which we see and challenges which are associated with the armed conflicts, pollution, destruction of nature, and then to map the risks, how it can affect civilians. Next slide, please. So, no, it's fine. Next one, please. So I think this one really summarizes from what has been mentioned, of course, by other speakers as well, that we have really various effects of conflicts, and each of these effects requires specific response. But for us, basically highlighting the issue and just like trying to make the issue more understandable is the first point. First, to inform the decision makers. Then secondly, work with the affected communities and organizations who help with data gathering. And thirdly, we try to use these facts and this data to channel that into the broader agenda in our advocacy. Next slide, please. So for instance, as the example, we have produced numerous reports, and this really encapsulates all of these various interconnections, because for instance, the report on deforestation in Syria, it really creates the link how the socioeconomic situation, which was mentioned by Elise, leads to people's logging and of course reducing the forest. But of course it connects to the climate change, because with less forest available, we can't really tackle the adaptation. So this is one of the pathways that we have identified in the particular country. We have also worked extensively on the topic of conflict pollution, and of course the Middle East there was particular focus because of the oil pollution coming from the burning oil fields and destroying infrastructure. That is definitely causing damages, which is very difficult to assess, but it's evident how it contributes to the global crisis. And among other examples, toxic floods as a result of oil pollution, of course, destruction of infrastructure, specifically in Ukraine, and how this all relates to broader challenges that not only environment faces, but also humans and public health. Next slide, please. And basically, in this first step, we have also taken the approach that's crucial to collaborate, because problem definition can be unique for each party, but when people pool resources together, it's really easier to identify the most common challenges and just really make the decision making on what to do with this a bit more efficient. So we have been working with a number of pioneers in data collection, but also with local communities on the ground who are directly affected by those effects. Next slide. But just really to move to the second part of this conversation about what can be done. We have observed that indeed it's not possible just to address one single aspect, because even the agenda of better protection of the environment relates to the need to convince member states who might have different considerations, who, as was said before, might have more instrumental views on the nature, and who simply might prioritize their security considerations over the nature. So this is how we try to link this whole debate in the broad environment, peace and security agenda, which we try to span across different UN forums. Next slide. And here, of course, I think it's also quite a good recap of how all of these stages of identification of the issue, channeling it to policy, providing better data collection, then providing better environmental assessments, rehabilitation and reconstruction to the communities, and using all of this further to strengthen international norms and prevent the vicious circle, which we have also discussed today. This is how all of these elements fit in our view. But of course, what we are noticing that even though it seems quite straightforward, there is still a big pushback against introducing more complex approaches how to deal with it. And now I would like to turn to our speakers how they see the efforts, current gaps, and what to do to overcome them in their respective fields. So probably we'll start once again with you, Dr. Oriana, in terms of all the devastating impacts of conflict pollution, which you mentioned. How do you think we as the international community on the policy level can address that? But also in your own work, in case you would like to share how you personally see a way ahead to address it, that I think will be very important to add this broader discussion on how we can better protect people and the environment from the effects of the conflict pollution.
Thank you very much, Christina, for that question. What to do about this interface? It's a big question. I'm happy to share some thoughts. I want to underscore the starting point is and should be prevention. This goes without saying, it's rather obvious. But I think it's worth highlighting because it is a fundamental purpose and objective of the United Nations to provide the means for a peaceful settlement of disputes. If disputes can be settled peacefully, then all of what we're talking about would not be of the dimension that we have already addressed. But since this is a bit of a reality as well, as our speakers have pointed out, including myself, a couple of additional points. One is, if we look at what's happening in the Sudan, there we see that there are industrial facilities that are next to urban centers, people living very close to industries that have been the object of attack, and that has created significant pollution, heavy metals or polycarbonates and other pollutants. And so one answer to that is the application, the development of environmental laws on zoning and on the location of essential infrastructure, essential services. Where are military fields, military airports, military bases located? Where are industrial facilities located? So there's one angle in terms of zoning and land use. Thinking about what to do, there's the issue of weapons designs. There's a whole edifice that looks at so-called Hague law, what weapons are allowed, which ones are prescribed. There's a whole regime dealing with chemical weapons. So when it comes to toxics and pollution, there's already laws in place. Now, there's a challenge in updating and refining those laws so that they keep up with the ongoing technological change, and with practices. We see, for example, that there are gray areas where white phosphorus as an incendiary weapon falls through the cracks, so it's not clearly identified. In this regard, there's an interface between the design of weapons and prohibited weapons and the conduct of hostilities and so-called laws of armed conflict that Professor also outlined. Basic IHL, international humanitarian law distinctions, as has been pointed out, the distinction between combatants and non-combatants. So weapons that are unable to discriminate, weapons that have widespread impacts and do not distinguish between combatants, non-combatants, or with military targets or environmental targets seen as civilian objects. This is the case of nuclear weapons. For example, those of you who have studied the international law and the jurisprudence of the International Court of Justice may be familiar with an advisory opinion by the principal judicial organ of the United Nations on this issue. Some have described this decision, advisory opinion, as a non-liquid, for to use the Latin, which is, it doesn't really address the question or answer the question. But what the court basically says there is that it cannot rule out that nuclear weapons may be used legally in situations of self-defense. But one takes that logic further, then it could be argued that in every other instance they would be illegal, and that is, of course, an important point, given the nuclear legacies that result from nuclear weapons testing, or certainly the use in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In addition to the issue of weapons designs and the conduct of hostilities in this regard, there's also what to do military guidance. It has been mentioned that the ICRC has come up with guidelines, that the International Law Commission has also come up with articles and principles. Now, how to implement that guidance so that military commanders on the ground are taking into account environmental impacts when conducting proportionality assessments. Now, in the heat of battle, it may be difficult for a commander to conduct an environmental impact assessment. That is, of course, not even possible. But certainly there can be guidance so that the equations of what is the benefit out of what all proportion in regards to military advantage can be done in regards to environmental protection. So that guidance needs to arrive to the hands where decisions are being taken on the ground. And then the last point I thought I'd mention in terms of what to do is to have adequate schemes for reparations at the end of the day. If we look at issues of victims' assistance and environmental remediation, there have been several instances where they have worked or they have not worked that well. For example, in my recent country visit to Australia, as I mentioned, the impacts of nuclear legacies on indigenous peoples, a fund was set up. The fund was quickly depleted, so the arguments goes, and so there weren't enough to cover all claims associated with exposure to nuclear radiation. A similar situation has occurred in regards to the fund set up by the United States to cover claims in the Republic of the Marshall Islands. Funds have not been enough, and a petition by Marshallese to the U.S. Congress for replenishment has yet to be acted upon. That petition is pending, and it's been pending for years and years, and the U.S. Congress is not acting on this. If we look at the situation of Agent Orange in Vietnam, the use by American forces of Agent Orange as a defoliant, as was pointed out by the professor, this has had impacts not only on forests in Vietnam, but also on the people and on U.S. veterans. And U.S. veterans, largely have obtained compensation and other forms of reparations. There have been also innovative tools to reverse the burden of proof so that a claimant doesn't have to show a causal connection between its symptoms and the exposure that it has suffered. But what about Vietnamese victims? Have they received compensation to the same extent? Well, they have not. This is clearly a discriminatory outcome. This is clearly a situation that is abhorrent to the protection of human rights. Several cases, the litigation in various courts in France and elsewhere have not been successful for Vietnamese victims, and they have not obtained reparations in this regard. So there's still a lot to do in regards to victim assistance and environmental remediation. The last point that I wish to make in this regard is that the 2017 UN Convention on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons contains specific provisions on victim assistance and environmental remediation. in regards to the territorial states, but also in regards to international cooperation for parties to that treaty that are in a position to assist, being encouraged and invited to contribute to addressing the legacies of armed conflict on toxics and on the victims of exposure and on the environment that becomes polluted. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this. And since you have mentioned a couple of times the international norms and regulations on what can be done and also the question of accountability, I think it's only natural when I turn now to Britta to continue the subject, whether you see any additional things, policies, norms, which we need to reinforce, so which we need to adopt. And maybe if you can elaborate not only about the protection of the environment, but perhaps also for the restoration of the environment. So how would you see from your perspective the path forward to address the challenges that we have discussed?
Okay, thank you so much. Well, I would like to probably begin with something like very basic and boring, and that is that we need better implementation and enforcement of the international law. Not even the most basic protection that is offered during armed conflict, like protecting hospitals or civilians, is not being upheld. So I think that's like the first step. If we could just implement what's already there in law of armed conflict, even the indirect general protection of the environment that I mentioned before, I think that's already a really good start. But of course, also the law needs to be improved. I think when we look at how the environment is protected under international law, and not just looking at the laws of armed conflict, but zooming out, looking at the broader spectrum of international law, like all the legal fields, we can see how the environment is traditionally protected, and like the regulation is really meant to humans to use the environment, to use its resources, to enjoy its aesthetical and recreational values. But we don't see so much the notion that us as humans, we are interlinked with the environment. It's really about humans in control of the environment. And we can even see it when we look at a lot of nature conservation, how traditionally nature has been preserved by separating nature from humans. And I think this is quite problematic, because this also creates this distance between humans and environment, which I think is also a problem for protecting the environment. But I think what is quite interesting these days is that we do see a shift coming mostly from national law, indigenous law, but it's coming up also onto the international level of law as well. And that is that we see the granting rights to nature. We see that there is a much more focus on the interconnectedness between humans and the environment, often in terms of biocultural rights. And this is a view that really sees humans as interlinked with the nature. And I think this is also something we see in other fields, like human rights law, for instance. We see a lot of the greening of human rights law that acknowledge that human rights cannot be fulfilled in a polluted environment. And we also see the emerging right to a healthy environment in the forefront of this sort of movement. And I think all of this will, in the end, also affect laws of armed conflict and the greening of laws of armed conflict, because this is not an isolated area. It will be affected what's happening around it and in the other legal fields, and they will also make its way into the law of armed conflict. And I think we can already see this if we go back to, for instance, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, and as a consequence of the breach of the UN Charter, a UN Compensation Commission was established. And this UN Compensation Commission granted compensation also for pure environmental damage, and this was not this was quite revolutionary at the time. And now we can see in a recent judgment of the ICJ that the DRC was granted compensation for pure environmental damage in a war context, coming from the damage that occurred in the 2 World Heritage sites, and Uganda was sort of responsible as being the occupying power, not able to prohibit the pillaging taking place in these World Heritage sites. So we can see that there is developments here, and I think also on a national level, it's important to see what's happening on a national level, because that can also in the end affect what's happening on the more international level. And at the moment, we see very interesting developments in the peace process in Colombia with the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, the JEP, that declared indigenous territories as a victim of the armed conflict, which is most likely spurred by the developments taking place in the national courts of granting nature rights in Colombia. And I think this is important also, or interesting in terms of recovery and environmental recovery, because I think we don't know yet what this declaration of the environmental territories as victims, well, it will mean in practice, but because the JEP has not elaborated further on this, it will happen in later procedures. But I think what's interesting is that probably it could cover also harm that are not typically unlawful under international law, that could perhaps also be included in how to recover the environment. And we also probably will see national judgments coming in the Ukrainian national courts on the crime ecocide in relation to the Kakhovka Dam. I also want to highlight all the environmental treaties and the treaty bodies that we have and that exist. I think that's still an underused resource in the international legal framework, at least when it comes to the recovery phase of armed conflict, or when the environment can be restored. I think there is already a lot of expertise in these treaty bodies. There is the institutional framework already, and the international norms are in place. But I think they need to be better implemented. I think it would be good to really push environmental treaties to be more active in conflict areas. I think there is a lot of work already, like conservation work, taking place in these conflict areas, but without the conflict sensitivity. So I would like to see more like explicit, a more like a explicit mandate from this institution to be active in, perhaps not in the armed conflict, but at least in the post-conflict and the recovery phase.
Thank you very much. And I think we can only thank you for providing this perfect segue also to Elise, since, of course, nature conservation was mentioned, but I know that it's not only about nature conservation when it comes to dealing with the challenges around nature, peace and security. So Elise, also connecting to what you said earlier, how would you see the comprehensive approach to tackling all these interconnected challenges from your perspective?
Thank you very much. I'll go back to where I started, which was governance, right? I talked about weak governance being a big issue because of the fact that when these things happen in places with weak governance, you find that it's very hard to control them. Even the laws can't protect you, even diplomacy can't protect you, especially when the local and national institutions lack the capacity to resolve disputes over the degradation or depletion of natural resources, where you have unequal power relationships and lack of transparency that exclude many from decision-making, where you have the rights of indigenous people and local communities and women not always recognized, where you have strong legislation undermined by corruption and weak enforcement, where decisions are made without consultation or serving only a narrow set of interests. All of those issues, for me, you have to deal with them because nothing else can protect you. Of course, the growing pressures from infrastructure development and others, we know those are affecting nature. And for us, when nature suffers, people suffer. Because people are dependent on nature, especially in parts of Africa where we have 80% of people, or even indigenous people who live closest to these natural resources. When nature is depleted, they suffer, and that's important to know. I mentioned earlier that, of course, all the money loss of resources that go to illegal wildlife trafficking and others that could have been used to provide social services. That's another very important point. And of course, the indigenous people and the communities really have to put their cultures under threat, they put their livelihoods under threat. And so for us, the solutions always have to go to that. Number one, the governance issues are extremely important. We need to resolve those. We also need to support these indigenous people, making sure that their rights are protected. The other one, of course, is we do address issues with illegal wildlife trafficking. We have a lot of work in that area as well. We work on that. I think there was mentioned earlier where enforcement is important, the enforcement of laws, all of that. But I want to also highlight a few things that we are doing, especially at a global level. I am a member of the World Economic Forum's Nature and Security Global Future Council, it's called, and we're really trying to bring more and more of this discussion on nature are important. We feel that the overarching challenge of nature loss still invades the high political debate, and we need more awareness and more interconnectedness because it is connected, as we said, to all parts of society, but not always sufficiently understood. And so one of the things we are doing is the need to create this understanding by using this nature security nexus I talked about earlier. Climate change and biodiversity loss are two sides of the same coin, but for many, these nature losses are manifesting through the climate change. And of course, climate change causes as well nature loss and other reinforcing factors. So an overarching nature security agenda that addresses all these issues is going to be really important. The strengthening of state institutions, of course, as I said, enhancing their capacity to manage them, to enforce is important. And of course, diplomacy, political negotiations, peacemaking and peacekeeping, all those are still important, but recognizing that there are other complex causes like social inequality, human rights violations, all of those, that they are correlated, and making sure that we look at this from a holistic approach that acknowledges that efforts to address national security and nature laws are interdependent, should go hand in hand, is very important. So in this Global Future Council, we're really working to create a comprehensive environmental security agenda that also addresses the root causes of biodiversity loss, insecurity, and conflict. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And turning to Ali, you already mentioned in your previous intervention about the need for advocacy and linking different discussions and different policy forums, bridging peace and climate divides. Would you like to add perhaps how do you see that specifically, especially as we are now at UNIA, COP has been already a month ago, but what would be your final message to our participants, how you would recommend to tackle those challenges?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I've already sort of spoken about a bit around the sort of context of this topic at the moment, and we are at a really, I think, quite vital moment where conflicts and the climate crisis are really at the forefront of both the public and policymakers' minds, and we really need to be able to connect these dots. So as we've mentioned, we at CEOBS and a coalition of civil society organisations are campaigning to get military missions on the agenda at COP and for the UNFCCC to make military emissions reporting compulsory. This means that governments would have to commit to robust, comparable and transparent military emissions reporting, which would be like just such a vitally needed first step to holding this sector accountable for its impact on the climate and on the environment. We've already seen kind of the issues with letting military organizations like NATO set their own standards here, which is why we really do need this internationally agreed level playing field of standardized reporting, and why the UNFCCC has a really kind of key role to play here. Importantly, reporting is a first step towards vitally needed reduction targets. As I've already said, I mean, at this stage in the climate crisis, we can't have a sector as polluting as the military to be fully exempt from action. And what we're kind of seeing at the moment is the potential for progress on this issue internationally, with both NATO and the European Union advocating for reporting and for reductions of defence emissions, interestingly. But political and public pressure is really, really vital at this moment to hold these entities accountable and ensure that this isn't just an opportunity for more greenwashing and empty promises. And that's really why this kind of interconnected working between the climate movement and the peace movement is really key. And we need, as I've already mentioned, the kind of a route to accountability that can only really come from a standardized framework for dealing with conflict emissions. And this is something that would have to, again, be internationally agreed. There is also a vital role for academia to play in producing these really essential military and conflict emissions estimations, while the rest of the data is not forthcoming, and providing this science for campaigners and for policymakers to really utilise to put forward our arguments for science-based policymaking. Yeah, so there's a really kind of multifaceted approach to advocacy and policy making moving forward, but I think it can only be done with the combination of the peace movement, academia, and the climate movement all kind of moving together with the force that is needed. Thanks.
Thanks. So if I am to sum up from what I heard from all of the speakers, I would say that perhaps 5 takeaways that we need to keep in mind how to proceed further: better rules, better enforcement or implementation of those rules, better governance, accountability, and looking beyond the very specific challenges that we see on the surface, but trying to address their root causes. I know that we are about time to end, but since we started just a bit later, I will just ask if we have any questions from the audience, and maybe we'll just gather them at once, or online or offline, and maybe we'll just stay for two more minutes. Yeah, that's fine. We have one. Please.
Thank you for the presentation that you presented by the speakers. The team that managed Sudan. I'm just trying to highlight something in regard to the prevention of using the toxic weapons. What the role that international communities can play, because when the conflict spread down, no one is care about legislation, the convention of conflict, and so on. So what we need to do is we need to ensure that the toxic and chemical weapons is not being manufactured, not being sold to different governments. That is very vulnerable, as well as a barometer for the case of Sudan. As 11 months almost there for the conflict of Sudan, have been witnessing that RSF have been using different chemical weapons. And we're just witnessing that from where they brought, what exactly is the role of international communities can play in preventing and such a procurement for a paramilitary like RSF. And then again, we return back for the long term of weapons in terms of contamination of water, because most of the people that they focus on the air pollution as a result of pumping. An example that a commitment have been mentioned yesterday in one of the events for the oil. But of course, there's some such issues that is not being mentioned for the water contamination, where we've been seeing a lot of weapons waste being dropped in the Nile, and all this is chemical. So of course, the Sudanese people will be affected, but in other countries like Egypt, it's also be affected in the long term. That depends for the Nile in the water for irrigation, the water for drinking and this stuff. So just need to be accurate on what exactly is the mechanism that international community follow to prevent the drug movement of the victims for paramilitary, for the vulnerable countries, even like Sudan and many countries in Africa, in Africa that they would be in conflict at any time. The coup in Africa is just something very common that you can sleep today and you will be wake up and a coup, and then the coup could be definitely developed into being an armed conflict.
Do you want to direct this question to the Special Rapporteur?
Thank you very much for your questions. I'm happy to share a couple of thoughts. One is that the responsibility for upholding international laws on conflict is not only vested on the warring parties, so on the parties to hostilities. It is also an international responsibility for those countries that manufacture and provide weapons in situations where they have reason to believe, where there is incredible risk, where there is a real risk that these weapons will be used in violation of the laws of armed conflict. This is a point that has been underscored in a statement released by Special Procedures of the Human Rights Council in a recent allegation concerning Gaza, for example, calling on the states that are providing arms to Israel to stop providing arms because they are being used in ways that are in breach of international humanitarian law. Several principles apply to the situation that you're describing. Thank you.
One more question.
Thank you, Christina, and to all the presenters. I'm Jerry Cunningham with the S&T community. I would just like to make an observation. Your last slide, Christina, on your presentation, on the right-hand side, you made reference to data collection, and in your other bullet, you made reference to the need for assessment, right? And down in conference room 2, as we speak, we have the conflict resolution being negotiated. And I was just looking at the version that they presented at 6 o'clock, just before we came here. And there is a reference to data. You'll be pleased to hear. Whether it remains in there, I don't know. But there was absolutely no reference to assessment, which I find ironic. It's just an observation I want to share with you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm afraid we'll need to recap here because we also have other obligations for our speakers. But I suggest to give a round of applause to our wonderful speakers and thank them for the discussion.